in Ukraine. We want to protect, fight.
Zanzibar's government says it's looking for ways to support them.
We are talking to their ambassadors, tour operators and hotel owners to find a way to help them. We want to plan charter flights to fly them to neighbouring countries, and we have now asked hotels to provide them with services during this difficult time.
In the meantime, expat Ukrainians have been providing assistance to their fellow citizens.
We're trying to be together with our people here. We are one hand, like here and the same in Ukraine. We support each other. And right now I took responsibility to help the people with medication here for those tourists.
As they wait for news, the tourists are hoping they'll be evacuated nearer home, though they worry about what they'll find when they get there.
Well, on Monday at a UN Security Council meeting, Ghana and Kenya called for an end to the violence in Ukraine. However, as international sanctions and condemnation of Russia's attack on its neighbours have gathered pace, overall Africa has been less outspoken in its criticism of the invasion. There have been expressions of concern, but few firm positions of opposition have been taken. Doug Yates gives us an overview of where countries on the continent stand with regards to the war.
Well, some of the countries which are now seated on the Security Council in rotating positions, like Gabon, which has just rejoined this year, or Ghana, or Kenya, have taken clear stands, that is, for the respect of territorial sovereignty. This is a UN position, this is an African position. And that, despite the fact that in the case of Ghana and Kenya, they're quite dependent on grain coming from the region. South Africa has had a turn in its opinion after remaining silent during the Crimean invasion in 2014. South Africa has asked for Russia to withdraw. It made a powerful critique. On the other hand, some of the countries in Francophone Africa, in the Sahel, like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Central African Republic, most notably, have been willing to express their support for Russia and play along with the misinformation that Vladimir Putin has been peddling. But the large majority of African countries have simply not stated a position, and that silence speaks loudly about how they might be trying to reposition themselves in a world where Russia is returning.
Mm-hmm. And amongst those nations which have been more open in their condemnation of Putin's war, is there a common denominator?
Yeah, many of them are democracies, and therefore Western allies, and therefore they side with France, they side with Europe in their opposition to what Russia is doing. Russia being seen as the proponent of authoritarian regimes, coup d'états. So, for example, in Senegal, you have Macky Sall, who is right now serving as AU chair, and he's asking for respect of international law. Clearly behind this is also a desire to appeal for democracy, for democratic values, which Macky Sall believes he represents. The same for Ghana, where Akufo-Addo represents one of the strong West African pillars for democracy in a region that's ravaged by coup d'etats and authoritarianism. And the same for Kenya. So these are democracies, they're pro-Western powers, even in the case of Gabon, where its democratic practices are questioned, its alliance with France, with the West, are not.
So what's motivating the countries who are hedging their bets when it comes to Russia?
Well, we've been looking at Russian military intervention and support for coup d'etats and regimes, failed states in the region. And we've been seeing a firm called Wagner, the Wagner Group, sending mercenaries in to try to create stability. And this has brought a lot of affection from the African street in Burkina Faso, in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in these countries that have fallen to coup d'etats and whose security in the war on terror depends on Russian troops. They see Russian military intervention as potentially a good thing. And of course, they're also being fed terrible misinformation over the internet.
Doug Yates there giving us a bit of an overview of Africa's positioning on the war in Ukraine. That is, though, all we have time for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
From North to South Africa, from Bamako to Nairobi, from Accra to Mogadishu. Bringing you all the political, economic, cultural and social news from Africa for a better insight into an ever-changing continent.
Across Africa, presented by Georgia Calvin-Smith on France 24 and France24.com.
Bienvenidos a las noticias de France 24.
Thanks very much for joining us. أهلا بكم في ثقافة في عدد اليوم. Ravi de vous retrouver pour Afrique Hebdo. Au programme cette semaine. نسمع بين حين والآخر. This storm has hit New York City a lot.
To be a president. 3, 2, 1.
Madagascar fait face à une seconde vague meurtrière.
Almost 99 million of you watch us every week. So thank you.
شكرا.
Gracias. Your confidence means a lot to us.
Muchas gracias.
شكرا على هذه الثقة.
Thank you.
Merci du fond de mon cœur.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Culture Daily. Every day, France 24 fills you in on the latest in the world of culture. In your Encore magazine, meet the artists, get to know them and their work, watch them and listen to them talking about their creations and the era we live in. Stay up to date with all things cultural in France and around the world. Get your culture fix daily on France 24 and France24.com.
France 24, your window on the world.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Russia bombards Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city, killing at least 11 civilians, according to Ukrainian officials, as Kharkiv becomes one of the war's major battlegrounds. Ukraine and Russia hold ceasefire talks in Belarus, but to no avail. The two countries' delegations plan to hold a second round of negotiations soon. And 500,000 Ukrainians flee the country in just 5 days.
heading towards neighboring countries to the west in a bid to escape the war. Watching France 24, thanks for joining us here on the program. I'm Claire Rush. The fighting continues across Ukraine as Russia's invasion now enters its 6th day. Ukraine's second biggest city, Kharkiv, came under bombardment on Monday. At least 11 civilians were killed and dozens more injured, according to Ukrainian officials. New satellite images, meanwhile, show a large Russian military convoy heading towards the capital, Kyiv. Maxar Technologies says the convoy stretches for more than 60 kilometers, with hundreds of armored vehicles, tanks, and logistics vehicles. Well, southwest of the capital, our correspondent Gulliver Cragg has been reporting in a village damaged by shelling. He gives us a story.
Ivan and Serhiy never thought the war could come right to their village. But on Sunday morning, Ukrainian air defences shot down an incoming rocket, scattering debris and damaging their houses.
So that's the situation. We'd been working for years on that house, my family and my wife's family. We were planning to move in this year. You could see it's now got no roof, no windows, and no doors. We won't be able to move in so soon. That's part of the debris. The rocket was aimed at somewhere else, but landed here when our forces shot it.
The air defense system worked, and they shot it down. Good that it didn't reach its target. They're not aiming at poor villagers. They want to hit our defense forces.
Nearby, galvanized by these events, villagers have set up a checkpoint and are working on a dugout.
We're going to fight the Russians and defend ourselves any way possible.
We'll fight them, of course. We're not going to let them stay and give them food.
Checkpoints like this are springing up all over the district, all over the country, in fact. The work of volunteers. Local kids are also involved.
There were more people here before, but they left because there wasn't much work.
Did you hear Putin say today he wants to prepare the nuclear weapons?
Don't worry, we'll shoot those missiles down with catapults.
Joking aside, this spirit of determination to do everything possible to fight off the Russians is to be found all over Ukraine.
Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin has put his nuclear deterrence forces on high alert in a Sunday statement criticized by the West as dangerous rhetoric. Well, for now, the U.S. says it doesn't plan on changing its nuclear alert levels, but Putin's statement has sparked concern, as some wonder how far the Russian leader is willing to go. Let's hear more from Andrea Sharon, a director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba.
Certainly, we've spent many, many decades trying to reduce and limit the number of offensive strategic weapons. We have treaties in place that should prevent their use. But if we get into a situation where the conflict in Ukraine is stalemated and there needs to be something done to escalate, that is certainly a possibility. I think everybody, though, is working to make sure that that does not happen. One of the things we always want to do is sort of verify what's actually happening on the ground. And even in the case of saying that his nuclear forces were on heightened alert, we need to confirm that there are actually things happening on the ground that would indicate that that is in fact the case. Unfortunately, there's so much mistrust. What Putin says versus what he does always needs to be verified. The thinking was to go in quickly from all directions, sort of the shock and awe talk that the U.S. used in Iraq in the early 1990s, and that they would quickly take control of key areas, military infrastructures, and things like energy supply sources and the like. I'm afraid I don't have much more to add on that, but it does seem, at least from many of the experts, that he is not going perhaps as quickly and with as many assets and forces as he certainly could. Whether he's waiting to escalate things or whether he's having command and control and supply issues, we're not sure.
Ukrainian and Russian delegations met in Belarus on Monday for the first face-to-face talks since the war began, but no breakthrough was reached. The delegations are returning to their capitals for consultations before a second round of negotiations, but Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Moscow of acting in bad faith, saying Russia continued bombardments during the talks on Monday. Here he is speaking.
Сьогодні за ініціативою російської сторони відбувся перший раунд переговорів між Україною і Росією. Ці переговори відбувалися на фоні бомбардування та обстрілів нашої території, обстрілів наших міст. Було видно синхронізацію обстрілів з переговорним процесом. Я вважаю, що таким нехитрим способом Росія намагається тиснути. Не втрачайте час. Тактику таку ми не сприймаємо. Справедливі переговори можуть бути тоді, коли одна сторона не б'є по іншій стороні реактивною артилерією, саме у момент переговорів.
Let's take a closer look at that first round of talks on Monday with Sinead McCausland.
Ukrainian delegators arrive in Belarus as Russia and Ukraine hold discussions for the first time since Moscow's invasion of its neighbor. The objective, to stop the fighting. Earlier Monday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky directly appeals to Russian soldiers to end the conflict.
Бросайте вашу технику и уходите. Не верьте вашим командирам. Не верьте вашим пропагандистам. Просто спасайте ваши жизни. Уходите.
On the Russian side, no clear demands were made, but diplomats said both parties agreed to advance talks.
И самое главное, договорились продолжить переговорный процесс. Следующая встреча состоится в ближайшие дни на польско-белорусской границе.
The Russian army passed through Belarus to invade Ukraine from the north. Zelensky initially refusing negotiations on Belarusian soil because of their alignment with Russia. On the ground, Russian troops lose momentum. Russian soldiers have spread across the northeast and south of Ukraine, but they have not yet taken Kyiv. Ukraine's military claims the Russian army has reduced its pace of the offensive, meeting strong resistance from Ukrainian troops. As the fifth day of fighting ends, Russia faces crippling economic sanctions, whilst hundreds of thousands of civilians flee Ukraine.
In a bid to forge a policy response to the crisis, the EU is planning on granting asylum to Ukrainian refugees for up to 3 years. More than 500,000 people have fled Ukraine in just the past 5 days, according to the UN Refugee Agency, with many crossing into neighboring countries such as Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania. Our correspondent Emmanuel Shaz reports from the Ukrainian-Polish border.
Here I'm at one of the checkpoints in Herebene. You can see at the very back there's a checkpoint, there's Ukraine behind that, and around 50 to 60 people passing through every hour. I was talking to a firefighter earlier. Firefighters here are very involved. You will see a lot of cars here next to me. Those are not only Ukrainians, it's mostly Polish people or Ukrainians living in Poland who are here and they're waiting for their relatives, for their friends until they pass the border. I could talk to some of the people who already came through earlier on. I talked to a family with a 1-year-old baby. The mother was saying that they live in Lviv, which is around 80 kilometers from there in Ukraine, and it took them 4 days to reach the border. There's traffic jam on the other side of the border of up to 50 kilometers on this highway. This highway is usually very busy in both sides. The bus you've just seen is one of the buses commissioned by the Polish government to go fetch refugees and bring them to other places, first in the area and then in other cities. Right now, the second bus you've just seen, full of people. Right now, the people are being taken to the nearest schools as emergency shelters, and then most of them want to reach bigger cities such as Warsaw, Krakow. Another bus just passed. The people I saw on that road, there's also people who come without a car. Those are the ones you see in the buses. The people I saw walking, they just have, they have their suitcases, they have their backpack. They all look exhausted, tired. Some of them have been walking for days. Some of them just looking for directions on their phones, The people are simply exhausted. There's still so many people behind that checkpoint trying to enter Poland, which already welcomed thousands of people on this very, very large border they share with Ukraine.
Emmanuel Shah is reporting there. Well, 12 members of Russia's UN mission have been expelled from the U.S., Washington citing national security and espionage concerns. Moscow, for its part, has called it a hostile move. Alexander Akot has the story.
The White House said the expulsion of a dozen of Russia's UN diplomats has been in the works for months, while they took time to verify their suspicions.
The United States informed the United Nations and the Russian mission to the United Nations that we were beginning the process of expelling 12 intelligence operatives from the Russian mission who had abused their privileges of residency in the United States by engaging in espionage activities.
They've been given until March the 7th to leave. Fresh from getting the news in a phone call, the indignant Russian ambassador called it a hostile act.
U.S. authorities have undertaken another hostile action against the Russian mission to the United States, to the United Nations, grossly violating their commitments on the host country agreement.
The expulsions came on the sidelines of a rare emergency special session, where the UN General Assembly's 193 members were called together to discuss the invasion. One by one, they called for peace, with a vote expected Wednesday on a resolution that demands Russia immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine. Russia, encountering a deepening global isolation, sought to justify the assault as a defensive measure. But the Ukrainian ambassador said the words and actions do not match.
Russia is attacking hospitals, mobile aid brigades, and ambulances. Do not listen to Russian lies. Listen to Ukraine's cries.
Elsewhere, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov cancelled his planned visit to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva this Tuesday, he said because of the EU's airspace ban, though he'd been given a diplomatic exemption. And it coincided with neutral Switzerland imposing financial sanctions on him, along with the Russian president and prime minister. Meanwhile, negotiators returned to Moscow and Kiev following 5 hours of talks at Ukraine's border with Belarus, with Russian shelling of Ukraine continuing throughout. During the meeting, they only agreed to keep on talking, with further negotiations due to be held at the Poland-Belarus border in the coming days.
Well, that's all from me for now, but do stay tuned to France 24, our continuing coverage of the war in Ukraine. We'll be back in just a moment.
You just heard from Abdullah Minyawi and the Kalgari Trio, a collaboration which unites the worlds of poetry and electronic music, artistic traditions from Egypt and Germany, and much more besides. Abdullah and Jonas of the trio join us in the studio to tell us more about this creative meeting of minds. Hi, guys. Now, you've just released the album Between the Bullet and the Front Sight, Casting Lots, and we're going to come to that in just a second. I want to hear more about it. But of course, coverage of the situation in Ukraine is dominating events here at France 24. As artists, as citizens, how does it feel to be witnessing what's happening there?
Brings me back to Egypt and the revolution, and yeah, it's just provoking something inside me. Something comes from this region, and yeah, of course, I'm observing everything with sadness and with the hope that it's over soon, and yeah, that's all. Sadness.
Yeah, I think so too. It's a big tragedy. I also know that in Ukraine there was a very progressive music scene that developed, electronic music scene also that developed in the last 8 to 10 years maybe. And so there were many bridges built, many connections, and yeah, it's very sad and very shocking. No one would have thought, I guess, really. Yeah.
It feels very close here in Europe, of course. Our live coverage of the war in Ukraine will continue after this programme. Now, to come back to arts and music now, I wanted to ask you about this latest record. It comes from a live filmed performance, and it's normally the other way round. You make a record, then you perform. Can you tell us about the birth of this record?
It started with a offer from a festival, from an online festival called Rewire, and they couldn't do the regular festival because of the pandemic, and so they asked us to do a film performance basically, and from there things developed, and yeah.
Okay, well, one of the tracks on that album, which I must admit feels quite politically and socially charged, was called Hajj. Let's take a listen. Now, that does sound, just sonically, quite dark. Abdullah, can you take us through some of the themes there, how much they're influenced by the world around you?
This one especially, it's a story of someone who witnessed an accident and then lost the traces. This is the phrases I am singing in this one. And for me, it was absolutely related to the Egyptian revolution. And yeah, it's kind of metaphoric way to look at it after all, like an accident that left no traces after all. So yeah, I'm connected emotionally to these sounds, and it's really natural. It's not something that I try to provoke or to search for it inside, just like that's how I think and how I feel.
Now, I noticed the cover art for this record features quite a striking image. I certainly noticed it. I found it quite arresting. Can you tell us more about that choice?
It was a scene from a film I played the main character in. It's called Tlamis, and it was premiered in Festival du Cannes 2019. So yeah, just I came up with the idea, I proposed it to the guys, and yeah, like it was a hard decision to bring this photo out, but this scene out. But thanks to Alaaddin, the filmmaker too, who just gave us the copyrights for free. And yeah, for me, it's just again like you are looking at a new birth, simply and metaphorically. That birth carries a future and destiny. So it's something growing with us. That's for me the artwork.
A powerful idea there. Now, I know that with your fellow musicians, Till Funke and Jonas Friedrich, the four of you have been working together for a while now, more than 5 years, and your mini-album from 2019 was applauded by the music press, especially a track that I'd like to listen to. It translates to The Act of Falling from the 8th Floor. Let's hear some of that.
خرسانة صعائق زوجتك ذراع جار قفص مسلك نوافذ حوائط مزالق لا يخلو الأمر من مزالق هبوط الطابق السادس علقت قبتي تأرجحت في الهواء كسرت القابض كان الحي على فوهته الكل يتسابق ظنا أنني السارق.
Now, Abdullah, I think that the lyrics there relate directly to Egyptian society. Can you tell us a bit more about the headspace you were in when you were writing that?
I was so frustrated and on the edge, to be honest, just looking at everything just collapsing after these dreams and desire of the revolution and change, basically. And then, I was in this, in my apartment back then on the 8th floor, just feeling so tired of okay, shall I jump or shall I just carry on? And then the poem for me just offered me this experience without really living it. So I described just the building, but I would like actually to listen to your point of view about this track too.
My point of view, my first impression was immediately I saw it very cinematically, the fall and this kind of slow motion fall, is for me, the strongest image on the album for sure,
Yeah, it's certainly very evocative in terms of what's happening there dramatically. Now, we're going to look at some new releases now, starting with pianist, producer, songwriter and singer Robert Glasper. The polymath musician has released the album Black Radio 3, featuring the neo-soul, R&B, jazz and hip-hop blend he's known for. The record features a roster of high-profile guest artists, including Killer Mike, Q-Tip, Gregory Porter and Jennifer Hudson. Here's a taste with the single Black Superheroes.
If I was facing death and I could ask one thing of God, I would ask for every nigga to be free here and abroad, and to be rightfully celebrated as a child of God, and to be rightfully celebrated as a child of God. Need a black superhero. Every block, every hood, every city, every ghetto. Need a black superhero.
So as we can see there, rap, R&B, very successful in the mainstream, and it does seem the dominant mode of expression when it comes to getting out social, political messages. But you're working with poetry, and I wanted to know from both of you, writing it, working with it musically, how does poetry, a literary style, bring a new dimension to the music?
I can't say much about his poetry because I'm not writing it, but I'm not creating it, so to say. But I can say something about our workflow, and maybe it's very open. We usually meet in a very remote house in the Bavarian forest, and we don't even have internet there. And we hide there for maybe 4 days or something, and that is that is our journey. Yeah.
Because it seems that your words seem to be a good fit for their sound.
I mean, on a spiritual level, I think we found each other, these guys like my family. But also musically, it's so natural. It's the poetry is maybe offering the depth of the experience easily to the spectator or the listener, because also you break all these patterns that's necessary in rap music. To write a text or something, you have to be writing in a specific way, but just poetry is giving more space to deliver a sound or to deliver a feeling.
Now, someone else who's celebrated for his way with words and unflinching engagement with contemporary questions of masculinity, social justice, and navigating a career in the public eye is Belgian artist Stromae. His long-awaited third album, Multitude, is out now, a return from the singer-songwriter whose single Santé last year celebrated the healthcare workers on the front line of the pandemic. This second single sees him wrestling with his own demons. This is L'Enfer, or Hell.
On croit parfois que c'est la seule manière de les faire taire. Ces pensées qui me font vivre un enfer. Ces pensées qui me font vivre un enfer. Est-ce qu'il y a que moi qui ai la télé?
Well, that's all we've got time for, but thank you to you, Abdullah and Jonas, for being with us in the studio. And that album, Between the Bullet and the Front Sight, Casting Lots, is available digitally and on vinyl. We're wrapping up the show with a new release from Florence and the Machine, who's given fans a taste of what's to come on the new album with a single drop this week called King. The band had sent some of their fans cryptic clues in the post in the form of playing cards, a nod to the title of this track. We'll leave you with a clip. Otherwise, there's more music news on our website and our social media channels too. And there's more news, of course, coming up on France 24 just after this.
I need my golden crown of sorrow, my bloody sword to swing. I need my empty halls to echo with grand sales mythology. 'Cause I am no mother, I am no bride, I am king. I am no mother, I am no bride, I am king. I am no mother, I'm no bride, I'm king.
They observe. They contact us. They report, film, photograph. They are the voice of the voiceless. Your eyes in the far-flung reaches of the world. The Observers, a network of 5,000 committed citizens working with France 24.
One of our observers in Côte d'Ivoire, Gaspard.
Amateur footage and testimonials checked by our journalists and broadcast weekly. On The Observers, on France 24 and observers.france24.com.
La Médina de Tripoli veut dire beaucoup pour les habitants.
Bienvenidos a las noticias de France 24.
Thanks very much for joining us.
أهلا بكم في ثقافة في عدد اليوم.
Ravi de vous retrouver pour Afrique Hebdo. Au programme cette semaine.
نسمع بين حين والآخر.
This storm has hit New York City a lot.
To be a president. 3, 2, 1.
Madagascar fait face à une seconde vague meurtrière.
Almost 99 million of you watch us every week. So thank you.
شكرا.
Gracias. Your confidence means a lot to us.
Muchas gracias.
شكرا على هذه الثقة.
Thank you.
Merci du fond de mon cœur.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
We're live from Paris here on France 24. Glad you could join us. I'm Stuart Norval.
And I'm Erin Ogunkeye. We'll be here for the next 4 hours of live news on the program. Here are the main news headlines today.
A 65-kilometre-long convoy of Russian military equipment and troops heads towards Kyiv. Shelling of major cities across Ukraine also being stepped up.
Well, peace negotiators from Ukraine and Russia are consulting with their leaders after a first day of talks in Belarus. The two sides are due to meet again in the coming days, but few signs of common ground. Stuart will speak to correspondent Jake Cordell shortly from Moscow.
And more than 500,000 people have now fled Ukraine, the majority of them into Poland since the start of the invasion last Thursday. We'll hear from our correspondent at the border there shortly.
Thanks for joining us here on France 24. Also coming up this hour, markets pausing for breath after days of volatility after the Russian ruble fell to a record low. We'll speak to our markets expert shortly.
And here in France, the authorities drawing up a list of property owned by Russian oligarchs, including luxury cars and yachts, all set to be seized under EU sanctions.
I'll be back on later in the program, but for now, here's the main news of the day with Stuart Norval.
This is Live from Paris. So it stretches then for nearly 65 kilometres. Tanks, military equipment, soldiers, all on the way towards the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. New satellite images then showing with the sheer scale of the Russian military machine on its way. Real fears then of a bloodbath as the capital itself has remained relatively calm, that calm before the probable storm. Air raid sirens, though, once again ringing out across Kyiv with some large explosions on the outskirts of the city. Alexander Orkot reports.
Huddled together underground since the first bomb started falling on Kharkiv almost a week ago, Ekaterina Babenko and her family have been seeking refuge with their friends in this small basement.
We've been here for days. We are here in the basement. We are worried and it is scary. We have small children, elderly people, and frankly speaking, it is very frightening.
Their ordinary life in Ukraine's second city was turned upside down from one day to the next. Above them, the authorities say there have been many casualties from street fighting, while shelling has been steadily intensifying. The Russian military has denied targeting residential areas, despite evidence of considerable damage to apartment buildings, schools and hospitals that have also killed civilians. Kharkiv remains under Ukrainian control, and the advance of Putin's troops is proving slower than expected. This is also true for Kyiv, although a major Russian offensive is anticipated at any moment, with US satellite images showing a train of armor stretching 60 kilometers long, some 30 kilometers northwest of the capital. Residents of Kyiv have meanwhile been forming long queues to get their basic necessities from supermarkets, quickly stripping the shelves bare after the weekend curfew, where many passed a miserable time beneath ground. The conditions are no better in pro-Russian separatist regions in the east, where people are also cowering in the darkness.
We're afraid of explosions and shrapnel. If you die suddenly, it's okay, but if I become incapacitated, no one will take care of me.
In Donbass, the Russian army is gaining ground, and pro-separatist leaders take delight in planting their flag on ruins, though for now at least, the other major cities continue to elude them.
Well, during the day yesterday, people left their shelters for the first time since a curfew came into place at the end of last week. Amongst them were France 24's team. This from Rob Parsons, Abdallah Melkawi and Clovis Casali.
Outside the pharmacies of Kyiv, queues snake down the streets. After a two-day curfew, a chance to breathe fresh air and stock up on medicines and provisions. Who knows when they'll get another chance?
My husband had a heart attack, so I need to buy medicine for him. But not all the pharmacies are open.
That it's unpredictable and it gives you all the time like up and down, and it's very hard to feel it, especially when you talk with your relatives, kids. You should be strong. You shouldn't show that you're afraid, but you're afraid, actually.
A man doesn't have time to queue. He asks someone to go inside for him. Being outside is risky. Russian missiles can fall at any time. Air raid warnings are frequent. People have already become used to them. Some here are buying supplies for soldiers at the front.
We are bringing money, we are bringing some stuff, so I was searching for like basic stuff, you know, nobody was ready, so guys asked me to bring socks. I was looking for socks, and I bought something super expensive, like twice as much as usual.
The streets of Kiev are almost deserted, but the train station is heaving. At the railway station in central Kiev, there are hundreds of people still trying to get out of the city. There's been talk of a safe route being created, but for the moment it's just that, talk. And in the meantime, people have been watching pictures of an alleged rocket attack on Kharkiv, the country's second city. Kiev knows it could be next.
Our Chief Foreign Editor Rob Parsons there. Now, peace negotiators from Ukraine and Russia are set to consult with their leaders today after a first day of talks in Belarus. The two sides are due to meet again in the coming days, amid, though, few signs of common ground. Still, though, there is a small chance for peace. Sinead McCausland reports.
Ukrainian delegators arrive in Belarus as Russia and Ukraine hold discussions for the first time since Moscow's invasion of its neighbor. The objective, to stop the fighting. Earlier Monday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky directly appeals to Russian soldiers to end the conflict.
Бросайте вашу технику и уходите. Не верьте вашим командирам. Не верьте вашим пропагандистам. Просто спасайте ваши жизни. Уходите.
On the Russian side, no clear demands were made, but diplomats said both parties agreed to advance talks.
И самое главное, договорились продолжить переговорный процесс. Следующая встреча состоится в ближайшие дни на польско-белорусской границе.
The Russian army passed through Belarus to invade Ukraine from the north. Zelensky initially refusing negotiations on Belarusian soil because of their alignment with Russia. On the ground, Russian troops lose momentum. Russian soldiers have spread across the northeast and south of Ukraine, but they have not yet taken Kyiv. Ukraine's military claims the Russian army has reduced its pace of the offensive, meeting strong resistance from Ukrainian troops. As the fifth day of fighting ends, Russia faces crippling economic sanctions, whilst hundreds of thousands of civilians flee Ukraine.
Well, meanwhile, the Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke yesterday afternoon with the French President Emmanuel Macron. Macron trying to, apparently act as a go-between between Putin and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Putin outlining his demands, including recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea, and, as he put it, the denazification of Ukraine. Well, we're going to cross then to Moscow, speak to correspondent Jake Cordell, who joins us from there. Jake, first of all, where is Russia diplomatically? We've got Putin making these demands to Emmanuel Macron. We've got negotiations underway, but at the same time, as we saw at the top there, this huge column of Russian military hardware is still bearing down on Kyiv.
Yeah, there's no signs that Russia's military campaign is slowing down. In fact, if you look at the images out of the Russian shelling of Kharkiv yesterday, it looks like it's intensifying quite dramatically. On the diplomatic front, it seems that Russia's demands have actually only got stronger since the beginning of the campaign. As you mentioned, Russia is now demanding that Ukraine recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea, which occurred in 2014, also calling for demilitarization of Ukraine, all the weapons to be pulled out. It wants Ukraine to sign some kind of neutrality treaty that would basically get at Russia's demands that we've heard for months, that Ukraine would never join NATO. And it also asks for what it calls the denazification of Ukraine. Now, that's basically code for President Vladimir Zelensky and his leading politicians to get out of the way, to resign. And as I said, those demands have hardened since the start of the crisis. So there's really no signs yet that Russia is willing to back down. At the same time, we see this status. Before the war, the US promised that Russia would become an international pariah if it invaded Ukraine, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Last night we heard that the International Criminal Court is opening a probe into alleged war crimes. It says there's a reasonable basis to assume that war crimes have been committed during Russia's invasion. And on the cultural, sporting, economic front, the whole world is pulling out of Russia. We have films not going to be launched in Russia, businesses are pulling out in Russia, companies can't do work here, prices are going up. So Russia really is looking incredibly isolated.
And what does that make life like there, Jake? I mean, presumably people are becoming more and more aware of what's happening and the way that it's starting to affect their daily lives.
That's right. Of course, from Russia's side, if you look at how the timeline of this invasion has gone, I think the consensus is it hasn't gone as quickly as it would like. They haven't been able to make a breakthrough yet. Whether they will in the coming days is another question. But of course, the longer the war goes on, the longer it does become harder to hide the effects of what's going on, both on the military side and on the economic consequences for Russians. So yesterday, we saw real chaos on the financial markets. The ruble lost around 20%. It's likely to lose even more now. The central bank had to double interest rate. They're up at 20% now, which really hits Russians given the high level of borrowing here in the economy. We saw runs on banks, people pulling out their foreign currency. Companies, especially companies that work with foreign clients, are already thinking about laying off staff because they can't keep it going. Economists are talking about a double-digit recession, a more than 10% fall in Russia's economy this year. And recently, the government is really scared about this economic crisis. It's banned Russians from sending money abroad, which will be a real hit to economies in Central Asia, for instance. So we're really seeing the spillover effects of this. Less than a week into the invasion, it's clear this is already having a very heavy economic toll.
Jake, thanks very much. Jake Cordell, correspondent there for the Moscow Times. Thanks. Now, how are other key countries reacting to the situation in Ukraine? Well, Beijing has called for de-escalation and restraint after it abstained, of course, in that UN Security Council vote on Sunday that called for an emergency special session to discuss collective action. China striking then a delicate balance in its diplomatic position on the conflict, wary of its close ally status to Moscow. Well, Catherine Carrier-Clifford reports.
Tiptoeing along a diplomatic tightrope, China's careful never to endorse Russian aggression in Ukraine, all the while refusing to condemn Putin's actions or even to use the term invasion.
在北约连续5轮东扩的情况下，俄罗斯在安全方面的正当诉求理应得到重视和妥善解决。有关各方均应保持冷静克制，避免局势进一步升级。
Though China has not held back when condemning Western sanctions, in particular the move to block some Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system, Beijing is striking a fine balance between defending sovereignty, a pillar of its foreign policy, and showing support for its close ally. China's often heard repeating that it doesn't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries and that others shouldn't interfere in its affairs. Yet the country continues to face international criticism over its own territorial claims. For example, Beijing has long sought to exert its control over the self-governing state of Taiwan. Last year, the island recorded 969 Chinese incursions into its airspace. Russia and China are one another's closest major partners. This cozy diplomatic relationship was on show at the Beijing Olympics, where Putin was one of just a few world leaders to attend. Earlier this month, the countries signed a wide-ranging strategic partnership aimed at countering US influence. They also said they would have, quote, no forbidden areas of cooperation. In a recent phone call, according to Chinese state media, Xi said China, quote, respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations and called for negotiations. According to the Kremlin, Xi told Putin that he respects Russia's actions. Meanwhile, Ukraine's #1 trading partner is China, so it's in Beijing's interest to keep up good relations with Kiev, a feat which seems increasingly difficult as Moscow's invasion intensifies.
Now, more than 500,000 people have already fled the fighting in Ukraine, the majority of them into Poland. Fears then will of a real humanitarian crisis, with warnings that the situation is only going to get worse. Well, our correspondent Emmanuel Chaz is on the border there for us.
I've been at the border point of Herebene. I saw people arriving. They were walking to the border. They were coming with their cars. People looking absolutely exhausted. Some of them had walked or even waited for days until they passed the border. At that border point, well, there's on the Ukrainian side, there's 50 kilometers of traffic jam. Some people were coming from the nearby Ukrainian town of Lviv. It took them 4 days just to drive those 70 kilometers. I talked to some firefighters who are helping with the evacuation efforts here at the border. They were telling me that they are bringing people, they are bringing refugees in nearby schools, which have been set up as emergency shelters. Most people, though, they don't want to stay here in the vicinity. They want to travel further in bigger cities, in Warsaw, in Krakow. There's also remarkably a lot of cars here of people who came to pick up relatives, pick up friends, people who came from Lithuania. I've also talked to some Zambian people who were studying in Ukraine. They managed to get through. That was a concern that had been raised first through testimonies in social media that they were concerned that they couldn't go to the border, that the EU border was only open for Ukrainians. That doesn't appear to be the case in that checkpoint. I haven't had time to check other checkpoints so far, but I've also met with officials of the Zambian embassy who told me that out of the 130 Zambians who were living in Ukraine, where already 100 had managed to get through the country, but every hour there's hundreds of people who are crossing this border. There's many more to come, in the days, in the weeks to come.
Emmanuel Chance there on the border between Ukraine and Poland. Increasingly isolated on the world stage, Vladimir Putin is showing, no signs of backtracking in his war on Ukraine. For many, the question now is, though, just how far the Russian president is willing to go to secure victory. Lauren Bearstecker takes a closer look for us.
While the world watched in disbelief as Russia invaded Ukraine, a question was on everyone's lips. What are Vladimir Putin's true objectives, and how far is he willing to go? Is his aim to topple Volodymyr Zelensky and set up a puppet government, or is he looking to maintain a military presence in Ukraine? Could Putin take things even further and launch an attack on Europe? Even his former colleagues say they're unsure where the Russian president will draw the line.
We entered the KGB Academy at the same time, in 1984. And I could already see one of his defining traits. He underestimated danger. He was a danger to himself and to the service, and that's why he failed as a spy. He was sent back to Leningrad, but that shows we need to take him seriously, because he's capable of anything.
Yet there are hopes that a massive Western sanctions package could help bring the unpredictable leader to reason. In the past, such sanctions had little influence on the Kremlin's behavior, but this time around, the decision to completely freeze out Russian banks from a global payment system could severely cripple the country's economy and ramp up pressure on Putin.
With SWIFT cut off and Russia unable to access foreign currency, Putin will run out of money for his wartime economy. Russian banks are already going bankrupt because they have no more access to funds.
The Russian ruble plunged to record lows on Monday, a sign the sanctions were already having an impact. But it remained to be seen whether a crippled Russian economy would be enough to influence the decisions of a man who's repeatedly shown a tendency for the irrational.
The main headlines for you on Live from Paris today. A 65-kilometre-long convoy of Russian military equipment and troops heading towards Kyiv. Shelling of major cities across Ukraine also being stepped up. Peace negotiators from Ukraine and Russia consulting with their leaders after a first day of talks in Belarus. The two sides are due to meet again in the coming days, but few signs of common ground. Now to some business news for you on the programme. It's been pretty mixed on the markets in Asia, really, due to a mix of different news. Now, of course, that Ukraine situation is continuing to weigh heavily, but at the same time, Asian factories have been reporting a pretty brisk recovery amid signs that coronavirus is having less of an impact on businesses. As you can see here, it's up across the board. Quite a big rise there on the Nikkei. In fact, just a flat, just under the flat line there on the Hang Seng. Well, let's talk to our chief market analyst at Xinity Group, Han Tan. He joins us now from Abu Dhabi. Good to have you with us, of course, as ever, Han. Let's talk about the positive sides of things for once to start with, Han. Coronavirus, I mean, it does sort of seem to be coming to an end, at least economically for now, and that's giving a bit of a boost to the markets, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think for China specifically, look, it's a sign that the central bank's supportive measures are having the intended effect, at least for now. But also, I think more importantly, the data on China's export orders, that also reinforces the idea that global demand is indeed recovering. And we have been accustomed to that narrative by seeing how commodity prices have been rising, right? But I think overall, there remains some optimism about the economic recovery worldwide. But having said that, that optimism could be dealt a massive blow depending on the true extent of the fallout from the Ukraine crisis.
Yeah, I mean, that massive blow it's been very sharp, very sudden, hasn't it? It only started, if you like, on Thursday, but all these sanctions that have been announced, I mean, it's bound to have a pretty negative impact, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And, look, markets are still trying to figure out what the total ramifications for the global economy is, right? Because it's not just these geopolitical concerns, of course, on a humanitarian level as well, but from a market's perspective, it could also feed into inflationary pressures and how central banks and other policymakers respond to this crisis. So I think it could significantly alter the equation when it comes to how policymakers, and by this I mean central banks, respond compared to what we had initially thought coming into this year.
What else are you watching, Han? I mean, oil is the obvious one, of course.
Yeah, of course. So for oil, we note the important OPEC Plus meeting happening tomorrow. And I'm sure the Ukraine crisis will be a major talking point at that meeting. But I think overall, the Ukraine crisis will be a major talking point at these economic events, right? So be it the State of the Union by President Biden or even Fed Chair Jerome Powell's testimonies slated for this week. So I think as markets get more clues as to how this situation develops, I think they will respond accordingly. Overall, we have seen a flight to safe havens like gold, for example, with the risk-off mode keeping the likes of stocks and other risk assets relatively suppressed.
And good to talk to you as ever, Han Tan, market analyst, chief market analyst there at Xinity in Abu Dhabi, joining us. Now we're going to have a quick look at what's happening in the newspapers, and the anger is really palpable across the British dailies today after several Ukrainian children were killed in Russian rocket strikes. The Daily Mail hails the humanity of its readers who've helped to donate over £1 million in just 2 days for Ukrainian refugees. It condemns as well Putin's inhumanity after those Russian bombs attacked homes and schools. Show this to Putin, the Daily Telegraph says. The paper quotes the chilling words of a doctor who tried in vain to save a 6-year-old girl. She died after her family's home was bombed. Show this to Putin, the doctor saying to television cameras. And that same image is also plastered, in fact, full-size on the front page of the Daily Mirror, as you can see here too. They call Putin a coward who, quote, kills little girls in slippers and unicorn pyjamas. The paper reaffirming the world's support for Ukraine. Her name was Polina, the Sun says, going with a full-page picture of a, quote, smiling 10-year-old girl with a pink streak in her hair. She was shot dead with her parents by Russian soldiers in the capital, Kyiv. Our press review at Diptyka Laurent will have a lot more on that and indeed the rest of the newspaper coverage on the Ukraine invasion in about an hour's time. Now, here in France, the French Riviera has long been a playground for ultra-wealthy Russians. But now the French authorities say they're drawing up a list of property owned by Russian oligarchs, including luxury cars and yachts as well, to be seized under EU sanctions. Lauren Bestecker has more for us.
going after the hidden wealth of Russian businessmen and oligarchs. French authorities said they were closely monitoring Russian-owned luxury assets on French soil and considering further sanctions against individuals with ties to the Kremlin.
We are continuing the complete census of financial assets, real estate, yachts, luxury vehicles that would belong to Russian individuals under European sanctions. We will give ourselves the legal means to seize all of their assets.
A known holiday destination for Russian oligarchs and billionaires, the French Riviera has begun to feel the pinch of these sanctions. This real estate agent says a rich Russian couple recently canceled their planned visit of a €7 million villa as they were unable to travel to France. And he's expecting more cancellations in the weeks to come.
We've been in contact with some of our Russian clients over the weekend. They're telling us that their bank accounts have been blocked and they can't pay for amenities, cleaning services or maintenance of their swimming pool.
On Sunday, two top Russian oligarchs took to social media to criticize their country's involvement in Ukraine. It was a rare show of dissent by Russian billionaires, whose fortunes have historically been closely tied to their loyalty to the Kremlin.
Laurent Bestecker there with that report. You're watching France 24. All the latest news, of course, coming up for you in the next half hour here on France 24. Stay with us.
France 24, your window on the world.
Liberté, égalité, actualité. Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Welcome back to you. We're live from Paris here on France 24. The main headlines today. A 65-kilometre-long convoy of Russian military equipment and troops heads towards Kyiv. Shelling of major cities across Ukraine also being stepped up. Russia's ambassador to Washington describes the expulsion of a dozen of its diplomats from the UN as a hostile move. A US spokeswoman to the global body saying they were shown the door after being accused of acting as spies for the Kremlin. And in other news, 1,000 helicopter rescue missions carried out in Australia as severe flooding hits part of New South Wales. More rain is also forecast there. Good to have you with us, and we are live from Paris here on France 24. I'm Stuart Norfolk. Also coming up for you, Russia set to be excluded from this year's World Cup and the Women's Euro 2020 tournament. Sporting bodies issuing then suspensions for Russia's national teams. So it stretches then for nearly 65 kilometres. Tanks, military equipment, soldiers, all on the way towards the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. New satellite images then showing the sheer scale, really, of the Russian military machine that's on its way. And there are real fears then of a bloodbath as the capital itself has remained relatively calm, the calm before the probable storm. Air raid sirens, though, again ringing out across Kyiv with some large explosions on the outskirts of the city. Peter O'Brien reports.
Travelling west out of Kyiv, armed civilians guard checkpoint after checkpoint. The road is littered with debris. And the entrance to the suburb of Irpin is guarded by local residents. Vitaly Kalman has just been issued a rifle.
From the military.
He says there was fighting on the other side of town the day before.
They try to come to the city, cross the city, because this is the straight way to Ukraine, to Kyiv.
People are leaving, traumatized. At the other entrance to the suburb, there's devastation. 2 Russian tanks have been destroyed and 4 Russian corpses lie strewn on the ground. The Ukrainian army successfully repelled the attack.
Врага нужно оттеснить к его границам и заставить Путина и сообщество, чтобы это все прекратилось. И судить, что Путина, что Лукашенко в Гааге.
There's no time to celebrate the victory as Russian forces are not far away. Ukrainian troops make their way to the front line of the fighting, and there are frequent explosions. Along the road to Kyiv, the Ukrainian army has destroyed a bridge to try and prevent the Russians from reaching the capital.
Well, France 24 has been speaking, of course, to those most affected by the fighting. We spoke to Vladimir Zelmalenko. He's a professor in Kyiv and chief editor of Ukraine World.
Across Kyiv today, we have been in the city, and the city is preparing for attack. It is kind of feeling itself very strong and very resistant, and there are many checkpoints through which you should go. Checkpoints with military Ukrainian men, with Ukrainian soldiers willing to resist and to defend the city. The electricity is there, the supplies are there as well. There are shortages of gasoline, of course. There are some lines to gasoline stations. Many of them are closed, but with regard to supermarkets, the shops are open, but there is certain shortage of some significant items like bread or milk, for example. You can check it on KyievDeclaration.org. It's an appeal of over 40 Ukrainian civil society organizations with 6 very clear ideas. First, to massively donate defensive arms to Ukraine, especially air defense forces, air defense arms, because Russians are attacking from air massively, by rockets, by missiles, by airplanes, by airstrikes. Second, crippling sanctions against Putin's regime, which is underway now, and this is very important. Also sanctions against the entourage of Putin, because so many wealthy Russians are actually having their assets in European banks. But also humanitarian assistance is needed, and what is also needed is establishment of a safe zone in Ukraine where no military action can take place, where actually the refugees can find their shelter, because in Ukraine the war right now is everywhere. It's a total war, and nobody can find his or her place safe. And finally, the mission to basically fix the war crimes made by Putin regime, because they are clearly war crimes. The attack against the civilians, all this should be documented, because it's a massive violation of international law. And right now, of course, we also need military assistance, because Russians are approaching Kiev, as you said. Kiev is very spirited to defend itself, but Ukraine needs support.
Volodymyr Yermolenko there talking to us earlier on. Well, further away from the major towns and the land nearest to the borders, Russia's attack is still being felt as well. Now, missile strikes are, of course, still being carried out, mostly aimed at air bases or other military targets. Local people as well organising themselves, ready to react if and when the tanks roll in. Well, this from France 24's correspondent Gulliver Cragg.
Ivan and Serhiy never thought the war could come right to their village. But on Sunday morning, Ukrainian air defences shot down an incoming rocket, scattering debris and damaging their houses.
So that's the situation. We'd been working for years on that house, my family and my wife's family. We were planning to move in this year. You could see it's now got no roof, no windows and no doors. We won't be able to move in so soon. That's part of the debris. The rocket was aimed at somewhere else, but landed here when our forces shot it.
The air defense system worked, and they shot it down. Good that it didn't reach its target. They're not aiming at poor villagers. They want to hit our defense forces.
Nearby, galvanized by these events, villagers have set up a checkpoint and are working on a dugout.
We're going to fight the Russians and defend ourselves any way possible.
We'll fight them, of course. We're not going to let them stay and give them food.
Checkpoints like this are springing up all over the district, all over the country, in fact. The work of volunteers. Local kids are also involved.
There were more people here before, but they left because there wasn't much work.
Did you hear Putin say today he wants to prepare the nuclear weapons?
Don't worry, we'll shoot those missiles down with catapults.
Joking aside, this spirit of determination to do everything possible to fight off the Russians is to be found all over Ukraine.
Gulliver Cragg reporting there. Now, Russia's ambassador to Washington has described the expulsion of a dozen of its diplomats from the UN as a hostile move. A US spokeswoman to the global body saying they were shown the door after being accused of acting as spies for the Kremlin. Alexander Alcott has more for us.
The White House said the expulsion of a dozen of Russia's UN diplomats has been in the works for months, while they took time to verify their suspicions.
The United States informed the United Nations and the Russian mission to the United Nations that we were beginning the process of expelling 12 intelligence operatives from the Russian mission who had abused their privileges of residency in the United States by engaging in espionage activities.
They've been given until March the 7th to leave. Fresh from getting the news in a phone call, the indignant Russian ambassador called it a hostile act.
U.S. authorities have
have undertaken another hostile action against the Russian mission to the United Nations, grossly violating their commitments on the host country agreement.
The expulsions came on the sidelines of a rare emergency special session, where the UN General Assembly's 193 members were called together to discuss the invasion. One by one, they called for peace, with a vote expected Wednesday on a resolution that demands Russia immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine. Russia, encountering a deepening global isolation, sought to justify the assault as a defensive measure. The Ukrainian ambassador said the words and actions do not match.
Russia is attacking hospitals, mobile aid brigades, and ambulances. Do not listen to Russian lies. Listen to Ukraine's cries.
Elsewhere, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov cancelled his planned visit to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva this Tuesday, he said because of the EU's airspace ban, though he'd been given a diplomatic exemption. And it coincided with neutral Switzerland imposing financial sanctions on him, along with the Russian president and prime minister. Meanwhile, negotiators returned to Moscow and Kiev following 5 hours of talks at Ukraine's border with Belarus, with Russian shelling of Ukraine continuing throughout. During the meeting, they only agreed to keep on talking, with further negotiations due to be held at the Poland-Belarus border in the coming days.
Now, ever since Sunday now, Russia's nuclear forces have been on high alert, put there by Vladimir Putin in response to what he's continually called those unfriendly steps by the West. In response, the US saying that Putin escalated the war with dangerous rhetoric. So what do we know, though, about the Kremlin's nuclear capability? Well, Emerald Maxwell reports now for us.
Vladimir Putin raised the stakes when he ordered Russia's deterrence forces, which wield nuclear weapons, onto high alert. An alarming move, given that Moscow has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, last year Russia had over 6,000 warheads, slightly more than its American rival. Of these, Russia has more than 1,600 warheads deployed, meaning they're on missiles or bomber bases ready to be fired at relatively short notice. Between them, Russia and the US possess approximately 90% of the world's stockpile. In among the Russian arsenal is a weapon known by its NATO codename Satan II. The RS-28 Sarmat is the largest intercontinental ballistic missile ever made. Russian authorities claim its range exceeds 10,000 kilometers, and it's capable of carrying between 10 and 15 nuclear warheads, meaning it could destroy a territory the size of France. The West fears that a constitutional shift from Russia's ally Belarus to allow nuclear missiles on its soil could now bring Moscow's devastating weapons closer to their borders.
We know what does it mean for Belarus to be nuclear. It means that Russia will put nuclear weapons in Belarus. And this is a very dangerous path.
Like other nuclear weapon states, Moscow has used its capability primarily as a deterrent. And this isn't the first time Putin has made such threats. Russian nuclear forces were also put on high alert during the 2014 annexation of Crimea to put off any retaliation.
Now, how are other key countries reacting to the situation in Ukraine? Well, Beijing has called for de-escalation and restraint after it abstained in that UN Security Council vote on Sunday that called for an emergency special session to discuss collective action. But China's been striking then, well, a delicate balance in its diplomatic position on the conflict, wary of its close ally status to Moscow. Well, Catherine Kedde-Clifford reports.
Tiptoeing along a diplomatic tightrope, China's careful never to endorse Russian aggression in Ukraine, all the while refusing to condemn Putin's actions or even to use the term invasion.
在北约连续5轮东扩的情况下，俄罗斯在安全方面的正当诉求理应得到重视和妥善解决。有关各方均应保持冷静克制，避免局势进一步升级。
Though China has not held back when condemning Western sanctions, in particular the move to block some Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system, Beijing is striking a fine balance between defending sovereignty, a pillar of its foreign policy, and showing support for its close ally. China's often heard repeating that it doesn't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries and that others shouldn't interfere in its affairs. Yet the country continues to face international criticism over its own territorial claims. For example, Beijing has long sought to exert its control over the self-governing state of Taiwan. Last year, the island recorded 969 Chinese incursions into its airspace. Russia and China are one another's closest major partners. This cozy diplomatic relationship was on show at the Beijing Olympics, where Putin was one of just a few world leaders to attend. Earlier this month, the countries signed a wide-ranging strategic partnership aimed at countering U.S. influence. They also said they would have, quote, no forbidden areas of cooperation. In a recent phone call, according to Chinese state media, Xi said China, quote, respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations and called for negotiations. According to the Kremlin, Xi told Putin that he respects Russia's actions. Meanwhile, Ukraine's #1 trading partner is China, so it's in Beijing's interest to keep up good relations with Kiev, a feat which seems increasingly difficult as Moscow's invasion intensifies.
Now let's have a quick look at some other news on the programme. And Australian Defence Forces have rescued stranded residents by helicopter after severe flooding in Australia's most populous state. The military helping to air